What's going on, everyone? It's Ben from YGO from Zero, back with another retro Yu-Gi-Oh video. I've been away for a little bit, but I'm back and I got some exciting tournament results to cover here because a lot of DM era tournaments are popping off, both recently and also in the near future. There's a lot of plans for formats like Yata and maybe even Warrior or some other formats like that. I haven't really gotten a tournament in a long time to get tournaments coming up relatively soon. So definitely head on over to the YGO from Zero Discord server along with all the affiliated Discord servers that cover those formats if you want to play in those events in the future, because they should be a lot of fun. Also, stay subscribed to the channel if you want to know when those sort of events are happening, because I'll be talking about them as they start to come about. So that's the best way to stay up to date on when all those things will be coming out. But getting into the results that happened recently here, I'm going to cover the, I think, more exciting results in the second half of the video. The first half of the video is still going to be pretty cool because there's some great decks that came out of the recent Fiber format tournament. But I do think that, the decks in this format are a bit less, sort of innovative than some of the decks coming out in Chaos format. Now, I say that, but there still were some very, very spicy brews. It's just, if you look at this chart, you see that a lot of it's made up of tomato control, which, I don't necessarily think is the best representation of the format, because again, with format library, which is where this chart comes from, the way that they classify sort of things, it's a bit imperfect. Some decks that you might classify as not being tomato control are classified as tomato control, and some decks that you might classify as something besides recruiter control, for instance, are classified as recruiter control. But still, I think it does show that there are a lot of decks are doing something very similar to each other. It's just the sort of standard style of mid-range deck, playing with recruiters to bring out other monsters, and playing big bodies as well, like Kaiku the Ghost Destroyer, Bazoo the Soul Eater, Gemini Elf, etc. Which makes sense given the time period that Fiber is set in July 2003. That's basically the best things that you could be doing around then. This doesn't mean that the format's bad. I actually think the format's really fun. And also, as you'll see in the deck breakdowns, there is still room for a lot of innovation. In the last Fiber format tournament, Gearfree did win. It didn't really put up any results in this tournament, but only 18 people played in this tournament. So it was a bit smaller than they usually get for this tournament. So in the future, Gearfree could definitely come back. Maybe Recruiter Control could also wind up on top in the future potentially. But for this tournament specifically, a more standard tomato control list managed to win. But let's go through the topping deck list now and talk about some of the spice that people brought to the tournament. We got to start with the Spice Lord himself, Aleph Yatu, coming in third place here with this very, very interesting list. Now, this list was classified as Recruiter Control, which is why I alluded to some of the decks being called Recruiter Control. Maybe you shouldn't have that moniker, because I don't really think this is a Recruiter Control deck. It is playing Giant Rat instead of Tomato, which is an interesting choice. But that also makes some sense because it's playing Flash Assailant. Flash Assailant is a monster that has 2,000 attack, 2,000 defense, so decrease the attack and defense of this card by 400 points for each card in your hand. So the idea is, if you're doing Mystic Tomato into like Sanguine or Witch, that searches you a card to hand, which is kind of counterintuitively what you don't want to be doing with the Flash Assailants. This deck seems to really be thriving in sort of a top deck war. When you get down to that point, Flash Assailant becomes a great body that you can bring out and attack over things. Gets over Kaiku the Ghost Destroyer, gets over Gemini Elf, doesn't necessarily get over a Bazoo with 2,500 attack. But still, it's a very, very good card here. And also, Bazoo can't get over Kaiku. So if your opponent does have a Kaiku out, then Flash Assailant is the way to go there. But very, very interesting list. Very, very aggressive. It's playing Double Knock in the main as well to sort of clear the way for its big bodies. Not playing Kaiku the Ghost Destroyer at all, using Flash Assailant to sort of take that spot, which is kind of interesting because Kaiku the Ghost Destroyer is mainly used to get over Bazoo. And Flash Assailant doesn't necessarily get over Bazoo. But it's still kind of cool to see the experimentation going on and seeing what replaces what. Also, double Magic Drain in the deck as well. Magic Drain can be very, very powerful if it does go off. Oftentimes, your opponent doesn't have another spell in hand, and they're really hoping that their one power spell goes through. But Magic Drain can be fired to sort of prevent that from happening. And at the very least, if your opponent just goes MST trying to blind snipe your back row, you can chain Magic Drain. And I mean, I guess that doesn't really make a difference, but so, maybe they discard a spell anyways because they're a bit spooked. But, in general, I think Magic Drain's fine. We've also got Time Seals here to chain to back row removal as well. A lot of people play Jar of Greed instead of Time Seal, but Time Seal does have the advantage that under Fiber Jar, this effect will linger, whereas Jar of Greed, if you draw a card off it, whatever card you drew will get shoveled back to the Fiber Jar, so it doesn't really matter. So Time Seal, very interesting tech here as well. Also, as a note, there's no Fiber Jar in this deck. It's very, very sort of lean monster count, very, very aggressive monster count. We got the Lily here. You can trash rats into things and go into Lily. We got Exiled Force here as well to go into off rat. But it makes sense why the monster count's so lean when you got Flash Assailant in the deck, because, you can't necessarily always play your monsters. You can always play your spells or traps, whether that be setting them or actually activating them. So very, very cool deck list here indeed. Side deck is sort of a mishmash of other cards that might be useful. There is a Kaiku the Ghost Courier in the side here. There's a Jinzo as well, a Shara Priest, Fiber Jar, a lot of interesting sort of text here. But I think this deck is super, super cool, and it does show that like there is a lot of innovation that can still happen in this format, despite a lot of decks sort of solidifying around one particular core. I hope to see more experimentation with this sort of deck idea in the future. Of course, going into the top 2 slots, we've got tomato control decks all the way down. So, these will be largely standard lists, I think. This is Lalo 8888's list here, and very, very good, solid tomato control list. It's got the triple tomatoes to go into your Witch and your Sangan. It's got Serpent, it's got double Bazoo, double Gemini, 1 Kaiku, injection Fairy Lily here as well, Fiber Jar in the main, 1 Knock in the main as opposed to 2. It's got 1 Time Seal in the main as well, along with 3 Jars of Greed to sort of dig deeper into the deck. And also, again, Time Seal does linger, unlike the Jar of Greeds do. So, very, very cool list here. It does have Cyber Jar in the main deck. I'm always a bit torn on Cyber Jar. Cyber Jar can be very good, but like the way I particularly view it is like Cyber Jar is better when you're in a losing position or you're just in an unfavorable spot. You set it and hopefully clear away your opponent's board and then get a good board yourself. But basically, you're taking a losing spot and you're basically flipping a coin as to whether it will still be losing or winning. And, to me, I don't like that risk factor. I'd rather just have cards that I'm more certain about what the outcome will be, even if those cards are less individually powerful than Cyber Jar. For instance, like Exiled Force only deals with 1 monster on the board, but at least I know that monster will be dealt with by Exiled Force, right? Whereas with Cyber Jar, it will deal with that monster, but my opponent might just get another monster here to replace it. That's even more powerful. So I'm not the hugest fan of Cyber Jar, but, Lalo did manage to make it to second place with this list, showing that Cyber Jar is a decent enough card. It's just, I wonder in the future, as time goes on, if more people will be cutting this from their lists. But still, very, very cool deck list overall. And congrats to Lalo for making it to second here. And finally, the winning deck list here, piloted by Aratos here. Aratos is bringing a similar list to all these tournaments in the past. But, that's just because it's a really, really good list. You've got a lot of great aggression. You've got triple Gemini Elf, 1 Bazoo, 1 Kaiku. You've got triple Tomatoes to go into your Sangan and Witch. You've got the Lily and the Exiled Force here as well, along with a Fiber Jar and a 1 of Magician of Faith to get back powerful spells. So that's all really well and good. Skull Lair is in this deck. I think that's a new inclusion based on what they said. And that's a very interesting card here as well because, Skull Lair, it's very popular in Android, or, I mean, I guess it's kind of declining in popularity in Android, but it's still a card that people play a lot in Android, but not as many people play it here. I think that's largely because with Fiber Jar resetting the graveyards, you, 1, don't always have the cards in grave to actually make use of Skull Lair, and 2, if you banish too many cards from your grave, then you don't have those good cards after a Fiber Jar resolves and shuffles everything back. But I do think that it is still a very interesting card in this format, and it's one to be experimented with more in the future. And, Aratos did manage to win with it in their deck, so hopefully that, helps people sort of try it out more in the future. One other interesting thing to note here, that Change of Heart is in the side deck, not in the main, which is very, very interesting because Change of Heart is a very powerful card. You use it to get aggressive, and in a format like this, getting aggressive is very important because life points at the end of the day is kind of what really matters in this format. Fiber Jar shuffling things back makes it so that, if you can just get aggressive as possible, then it's very good for you, and Change of Heart allows you to do that. But, it worked out for Aratos here. It seems like they didn't really miss it, so maybe they'll get people reevaluating this sort of card in the future because, it is sort of seen as one of the staple cards of the format, but if you can make it to the finals and win the finals with a Change of Heart on the side, maybe it's not as good as a lot of people give it credit for. But still, very, very cool list here. Very, very good stuff from Aratos. And I'm curious to see if people will adopt some of this moving forward as people continue to iterate on tomato control and continue to optimize it further. Now that we've covered Fiber, let's dive in to the next coverage here. And I think it's more of the exciting coverage, something I'm probably going to put in the thumbnail or title because it really is exciting. We had a Chaos format tournament wrap up just this past weekend. And while, Chaos format, which is the format held in June 2004 with the sort of tier 0 Chaos deck where you got CED, BLS, etc. And it's sort of viewed by a lot of people as the first tier 0 format in the game's history, although I would argue that like Android format is more tier 0 and also earlier than this one is. Recently, there was a tournament in it, and in the finals, there was a deck that was not the standard sort of Chaos list, actually managed to make it there, and it was a pretty intense game there in the finals, so that deck could have potentially won. Unfortunately, it didn't quite take the title home. A bit of a spoiler there, but if you want to watch that match, definitely check out the stream I did for that finals game. But still, the fact that something like that made it all the way to the finals means that there is hope for this format, not necessarily being as tier 0 as a lot of people give it credit for. But before we dive into that, let's talk about the deck type representation, which, does sort of point to it being tier 0, right? You've got 20 people on Chaos Control, 1 person on Scientist FTK, 1 person on Jar Turbo. FTK decks are kind of in a weird spot because, like, I think that FTK, while it is a deck you can play and while it can, like, cheese some wins, I don't think in most tournament settings it's really that good because just too much has to go right in order for you to even make it to top cut, and then to then expect you to be able to win that top cut is just a bit too much in terms of luck. So I don't think that, Science FTK is ever going to be a big deck in this format, so I don't really think that makes it non-tier 0, but I think the other deck that managed to do very well in this tournament, Jar Turbo, could potentially be something that people continue to experiment with, continue to play in the future, and continue to win with in the future. So let's dive into the topping deck list and, feature that Jar Turbo deck list and talk about what its strengths are, what its weaknesses are, and whether I think people will continue to play it in the future. Okay, the Chaos tournament had a top 8 as opposed to a top 3 because it was Swiss and not double elimination. So there's a lot more deck lists to talk about here, even though the total player count was, not really that different, 22 versus 18. But, more decks to talk about, so I'm happy to dive into it. And this is the sort of tied for 7th place. I believe it's counted as tied for 7th, maybe tied for 8th place list by Barcode here. And this is Chaos Control. Now, I think that, like, sort of the distinctions between Chaos Warrior and Chaos Control in this format are very, very slim. I think the line between them is not really that big because, in this format, nothing's banned yet. So there's so many staple cards that everyone's playing. And it means that, like, if you have a one of Tekton Rhoda here, does that make it a warrior list or does it make it a control list? Because, every deck's playing a triple warrior lady or some high amount of warrior ladies and maybe like an exiled or a Zambira or something like that. But, like, is this a Chaos Warrior, Chaos Control? I don't know. I'm not sure what you'd classify it as. So, I'm just going to call these decks Chaos. If they leaned heavily into the control or the warrior aspect, then I might mention it more. But I think overall, this deck is just chaos. And that's what a lot of people think of in this format. They think about chaos decks, right? Because that is the dominant thing. Can anything beat the chaos decks? Not can anything beat the chaos control or chaos warrior or chaos whatever have you decks in the format. So for the rest of this video, I'm just going to call them Chaos decks. And there are some interesting choices in this list that I just want to point out. Sook is definitely not a, sort of mainstream main deck choice in this format. People definitely have different things, but if they're playing things like Magical Scientist, it can make sense because if you flip down a fusion monster brought out of Magical Scientist, then you do get to keep it around. It doesn't go back to the extra deck at the end of the turn. You can also use this to flip down things like a Magician of Faith, which, Barcode is playing 3 of, so flip Magician Faith, get back a Power Spell, flip down the Magician Faith with the Sook, and then you get back a Power Spell later. So Sook is pretty good in this format. But I do think that, like, this deck is very, very interesting. It's doing some interesting things because Scientist is not a standard pick by any stretch because, you do have to pay a lot of life points to actually take use of this card. And in this format, which is very, very aggressive, very, very explosive, that sort of life point loss can really cost you. So not as many people play Scientist, or if they do play Scientist, they play it with things like Metamorphosis or things like that, which is not in this deck. So this is a very, very interesting list. But I'm not really going to spend too much time on it because, again, I do think that there are a lot of standard things in here. And if I get bogged down with every sort of deck talking about these standard stuff that that deck does, we'll be here all day. So just interesting thing to point out. The Warrior Lady, Rhoda, Zambira, double spy instead of 3 spies. Fiber Jar in the main isn't necessarily the most common thing in the world as well. And now let's dive into the next topping list. Next topping list is by iModel, and again, this is another Chaos deck, and again, this deck is playing Scientists, so maybe that shows more of an uptick in people playing Scientists, but I do think that this is one of the last ones in the top cut that plays Scientists, and maybe the fact that many of the decks playing Scientists didn't make it further than the sort of, like, tied for 8th or 7th or whatever you call it slot is a sign the Scientists is maybe not the best in this format. But people are playing it still, and it can be pretty good. This deck has Yata in it, so if you want to go for the Chaos Yata Lock combo, you can do it. I don't really think that combo is that consistent. I made a video testing out that combo in a deck that was trying to maximize your chances of doing it, and we still weren't able to do it there. But if it ever does come up, it can be pretty good to have here, so makes sense why they're playing it. Tribe Infected Virus, very, very powerful card in this deck. Makes sense why that's here as well. Triple Warrior Lady makes sense, very powerful light monster here. And that is, I think, the only real light monster. No, Magician of Faiths are in here as well, so that's your other light. So you do have a fair amount of lights here from Model's deck. Okay, the Good Destroyed to stop other Chaos decks. You got a lot of powerful stuff here under the hood. No Fiber Jar in the main, which makes sense. A lot of decks aren't on it. No Spies in the main as well. Spy is a card that has been seeing more popularity lately, but some decks are not playing it still. Oh, Fiber Jar is in the main. I don't know how I missed it. So yeah, Fiber Jar is still in the main here. Again, not really a standard choice, but it is very powerful if you're able to pull it off. And yeah, no Spies in the main. And I think that's all I really want to talk about for this deck. As again, a lot of these decks are very standard and share a lot of similarities between each other. Okay, for our next deck, we've got Clemexon's 12 on this Chaos Control or Chaos list. We got another Chaos list here. Unsurprisingly, some interesting things here, though. Got the Triple Thunder Dragons, got the Spies here, unlike in Model's list. And I realized, what the confusion was with the tying. We actually have 9 deck lists to show here because there was like a bubbling on the top cut. So that means that Barcode's list was actually 7th, and these decks that I've been showing off are tied for 5th. So sorry about that confusion. But anyways, Thunder Dragons here, they pair with the Tri-Infecting Virus, which is very nice. They're lights as well, thin out your deck a bit, so that's pretty good. Raigeki Break is in here as well to pitch Thunder Dragons too, so that's kind of nice as well. Raigeki Break isn't necessarily the most standard inclusion, but if you're playing TDs, it makes sense why it's in here. Raigeki Break can also stop things like Mirage as well if you don't draw into your Typhoons, so that's pretty good too. So all in all, I think this is a very, very cool list. I'm curious to see how the other decks deal with Thunder Dragon or don't have Thunder Dragon, because Thunder Dragon is sort of an iffy card. Some decks play it, some decks don't. But it's still a very, very cool card in this format, and it can be good to get lights engraved, because lights are definitely the harder thing to get engraved compared to darks in this format. The next list we got here is Hylians, and this is a very, very cool list. This is more leaning into the warrior aspect of Chaos. You've got the Double Rota, you've got a Dawn's Luge as well, you've got an Exiled Force too, which are, again, not really common choices here, but they can be pretty good, especially if Dawn rips a card out of hand. The unfortunate thing about Dawn, though, is that if you do rip a light or dark, then you're setting up your opponent's graveyard potentially, so that's a bit awkward, but it clearly worked out for Hylian here, and they've also got the Zambira, just like Barcode's list had there. Zambira, pretty good card overall. 2100 attacks, nothing to scoff at. It's a dark as well, so that's pretty good. Cylinder, another interesting inclusion in the deck, dealing a bit more damage there. And with CD in the deck, getting them below certain damage thresholds can be very, very nice there. So very cool stuff. In terms of the side deck, it doesn't look completed here, but, I think that's fine. More room for growth in the future if people test it out and want to add more things to the side deck here. And the extra deck also is empty here, which probably should, be there just in case you take control of an opponent's like Scientist or something like that to go into stuff from the extra deck there. But this is a format where you proxy in cards from the extra deck because it's unlimited, and so you can play as many cards in your extra deck as you want to at this point. So yeah, I mean, you could potentially proxy in something, but it's good to have your extra deck filled there. But either way, very, very cool stuff. More aggressive deck, playing triple Kaiku here, playing the double Rotas to go into Zalug, Exiled, Zambara, etc. So very, very cool stuff there. And congrats to Hylian, because Hylian has been playing a lot of these retro formats over the past couple of months, and this is, I believe, their first top. So very, very good job to Hylian, and very, very cool deck list indeed. The last of the tied for 5th decks, we've got Hoy here, and this is a very interesting deck because playing Archfiend Soldier as a dark beater, 1900 attack. Also playing a Reflect Boundary here as a good light monster that can deal a bit of burn as well. So very, very cool in that respect too. Also triple Bottomless Trap Hole here, not playing the TTs, instead playing the Bottomless Trap Hole to deal with the Chaos monsters. Makes sense there. You don't want to necessarily lose your own monsters, especially when you're playing things like Archfiend Soldier, to just keep pressing that offensive pressure there. So very, very cool stuff there. Lily is in the main deck as well. I do like Lily in the main deck. I know a lot of people don't play Lily in the main deck because it's not a light or dark, but having 3400 damage out of nowhere is very good. It can also deal with CD, BLS, etc. So I do like Injection Fairly a lot in these decks, and I'm curious to see if people will continue to experiment with that more. Double Knock here to get more aggressive. This is a more aggressive build, more aggressive Chaos stuff. So the knocks make sense. Cylinder as well in this deck, just like in Hylian's deck. So that is also very important to just keep getting aggressive, prevent your monster from being destroyed, and also deal that burn damage as well. So a very, very cool deck list overall, and I'm curious to see how they iterate in this in the future. One other thing I want to note here is that there is Neko Mana King in the side deck, which will, I think, be a more common side deck inclusion here once you see some of the deck lists coming down later in the future. Also, triple Dust Shoot here. I saw a lot of people siding in Dust Shoot because, if you're going first, can be good to bring in things like Dust Shoot to just guarantee more hand rips there. And as a note, no Duo in the main as well. Duo's in the side deck. I think that's fine. I think Duo is kind of underwhelming in this format, which may seem weird to say, but every single card's a power card. So even if you're taking those power cards, your opponent's left with many in hand, and it can also set up light and dark stuff. So you don't necessarily want to do that for your opponent. So I respect Duo being in the side deck as opposed to the main. Also, Serpent in the side deck is kind of interesting. but I can see that as well, because, it is sort of a low impact card compared to some of the other stuff, but still very, very cool list. This seems really, really clean, and I'm curious to see what they do with it in the future. Next up, getting into the third place list, we got Straight Outta Compton here, aka Lil Man Yu-Gi-Oh, who's known for their Amaryllis builds in Edison format. Very, very cool duelist, and they've got a great YouTube channel as well. So I'll link that in the description here if you want to check them out more. Not sure if they're going to be doing a video on this build and this tournament, but they have done one for their tournament run in the past, so they might do it in the future. But still, very, very cool list here. They're playing the Triple Thunder Dragon here. They're playing the Scientist. They're playing Yata Garasu as well, which are 3 cards that I've said, like, people go back and forth on and debate about. But, Straight Outta Compton is playing all 3 of them, and, it worked out pretty well for them because they managed to get tied for third, so that's pretty good. And I will say, Upstart Goblin, also a very interesting card in this deck, because you're just trying to turbo into your big stuff, which makes sense. I think Upstart Goblin could be a lot more popular in this format in the future because, again, getting into your CD, getting into your BLS a lot quicker is very, very good. So I could see something like Upstart, being adopted by more decks. The downside to Upstart is that, like, life points really do matter in this format, so you are giving your opponent some life to draw deeper, but I do think that overall the benefits outweigh the downsides there. Raigeki Break also in this deck as well, so, maybe that will see even more play in the future, but, with Thunder Dragon in the deck, it makes sense why you're playing those Raigeki Breaks. Still a very, very cool deck overall, and I'm curious to see what they continue to bring to these tournaments because they always bring something a bit interesting, a bit off the sort of standard build. So I'm curious to see how they continue to iterate on this strategy in the future. Lastly, for the tied for third place list, we've got Lalo8888 again. Again, making it very, very far in the tournament, but not quite winning. But they've won tournaments in the past, and I'm sure they'll win more tournaments in the future. They're very, very good duelists. But, again, we see some interesting choices here. Scientist and Fiber Jar in the main, which, again, people go back and forth on. Again, I'm not really the biggest fan of Scientist overall. I think it just costs too much life points and leaves you vulnerable to more attacks later. But it can be very powerful, as, shows in these deck lists, where it shows in a variety of topping deck lists. So maybe I should reevaluate my stance on the card. But Zambira here, seeing play in the deck. One Rhoda to go into the Zambira, but no other warrior targets besides your Warrior Ladies and your Zambira, but still very, very good card to get over things like Spy, which is becoming more popular, and Lalo is playing 2 of them in their deck as well. So, I expect to see more people playing Zambira in the future, especially when we look at the first place list here. But still a very, very cool deck overall. Again, a lot of the differences between these decks just come down to ratio things or different tech choices. So there isn't really much to talk about here that I haven't talked about already, but I think it's a very, very cool list and a very, very clean list if you want to pick up something like this for yourself. Now, of course, we've got to talk about the spice of the tournament, the talk of the town, which is GMYFS's DMOC Turbo list, aka 3MOC, aka Jar Turbo, aka whatever you want to call it. This list is sick. Now, GMYFS has been experimenting with this list for quite some time. I believe I featured an earlier version of it in a previous video on the channel. I might want to just dive back into this format and, sort of show off this deck playing on the channel in the future. Because this is just so clean, so sick, and there's definitely a lot more to explore with this deck because this is still an early draft, even though it really did go far in this tournament and is very, very good. I definitely think that there are some things that could change about it in the future, and GeoMyFS is still tinkering with it, so we'll have to see exactly what this deck looks like in the future. But basically the idea of it is that you're trying to use things like Morphing Jar and Cyber Jar along with things like Book of Moon, Book of Taiyu, etc. to sort of just make these loops, dig really deep into your deck, get DMOCs and stuff in the grave, and then revive those DMOCs and go for a huge OTK. And there's some interesting techs in the deck as well to ensure that game plan goes through. You get triple Cold Wave here to protect your jars. Nothing worse than setting a jar and then your opponent like Raigekis or knocks it or something on the following turn, and then you've basically lost a turn. If you activate Cold Wave, your opponent can't do that. Also, they can't set their hand to avoid something like Morphing Jar's effect or Cyber Jar's effect, and that is very, very good for you. And it ensures that your plays go through a little bit more, and you've got the priority to actually play things as opposed to your opponent who can't even set the cards that they draw off a like Cyber Jar or Morphing Jar, etc. So very, very cool tech here, and very, very scary tech as well. We saw multiple games in the tournament where GMYFS just opened up with a jar and Cold Wave and just won the game off the back of that. So strong. Dimension Fusion in the deck as well to bring back the Dark Magician of Chaoses, although I did see GeoMyFest mentioning that maybe in the future they might, cut bulk, they might cut Dimension Fusion, things that they felt like are strong on paper but are a little bit underwhelming in actually playing the deck, which again shows how this deck is still evolving and there are still definitely changes that can be made to it. Still, very, very awesome deck list here. Very, very cool deck that I assume more people will be pulling up in the future. This deck didn't win, but I do think its presence at second place here shows that this deck, may be good enough to creep into tier 1, along with the sort of chaos decks as well. So it's a very, very different style deck. It is still playing BLS and CED, sure, but I would honestly classify it as non-chaos, even though it does have these monsters, because its game plan is not chaos. Its game plan is, just abusing DMOC and just getting back powerful spells and going for an OTK on your opponent. So I think this is definitely in a category of its own, and I'm curious to see people experimenting with it more in the future. Although, again, as I mentioned with Neko Mane King, that deck can give this deck some trouble. Anti-Spell Fragrance can also be a bit problematic for this deck. So there are ways that other decks can sort of side deck to play around this deck, but I think that it's really, really cool that I managed to make it this far in this tournament, and I do think that it will continue to top in future events. Unfortunately for 3 Mock Turbo, it didn't quite make it to the winning spot in this tournament. That was won by Danny Droid with this Chaos list here. Again, I'm not really going to classify as Chaos Warrior, Chaos Control. It does have a Rhoda here, but it's only got one, so which one should it be? I think it's just Chaos. Just call it like it is. This is Chaos format. This is a Chaos deck. So very, very cool stuff here. And Scientist is in this deck as well. So, Scientist may be more powerful than I've given it credit for. Maybe more people should play around with it. But, showing the power of that, showing Shining Angel in the deck as well, getting a Light Engrave and getting something like Warrior Lady out on the field. I honestly prefer Shining Angels to Thunder Dragons because it still gets the Light Engrave, it still deck thins. But also you manage to get out a powerful Warrior Lady as well if you need that, and you manage to retain field presence. And it's less of a brick. There have been multiple scenarios in this format where I've been drawing in top deck mode basically, and my opponent's been low life, and I've drawn into a Thunder Dragon, and I was like, man, if that was just a Shining Angel, this would have been a lot better here. And in general, it's not really the best to sort of decide your deck layout based on that sort of thing. But I do think that like Shining Angel is, in my opinion, the better sort of light turbo target where like you're trying to get Lights Engrave and deck then. Shining Angel, I think, is the better option for that. That's just my opinion on it. But I'm curious to see if more people adapt it in the future because, it wasn't really in many of the other topping lists, but Danny Droid is repping it here in the winning deck list. So very, very cool stuff there. Besides that, pretty standard list overall. Again, there's not much variance between these lists. A lot of them are doing very, very similar stuff, but it's still cool to see the tech cards like Scientist and Shining Angel in the deck. And I'm curious to see how this deck will continue to be optimized in future events. I've got some ideas for what I'm going to bring to future Chaos tournaments. Things that are a bit more off the beaten path. This tournament, I brought a deck playing like Chaos Orcs. I didn't really think that was the way to go. A bit of a side note because, it's not in the topping list, but I don't think the Sork is it in this format. So I'm going to mix it up a bit, play something a little bit different for the next event and see how that one goes. If you want to join in the future tournaments for this format or any other format that I feature on the channel, head on over to the YGO from Zero Discord server. They're often announced there. And also join the Chaos Corner Discord server as well as the Fiber Jar Discord server for specifically Chaos events and Fiber events. Now, if you like this video, definitely subscribe, leave a like down below, comment as well, do all the YouTube stuff. It really helps grow the channel. We're trying to reach 1,600 subscribers by the end of this month, and I think we should be able to do it. We're only about 30 away, and so it's definitely a doable goal. Also, big shout outs to my patrons for supporting me with all these videos. So big shout outs to GeoMyFest, Rinspin, Porkchopcoon, Bren Donker, Dump Truck, and Tyler Compton. It really means a lot that you support me this way and encourage me to make more videos like this in the future. But that's going to do it for this video. I hope that you all enjoyed as always, and until next time, I've been Ben from YGO from Zero, and I'm signing off.